Welcome to another episode of Resetology, where conversations revolve around changing from the inside out. My name is Carissa, and I'm here today with Jeff and Julie. Jeff, what are we going to talk about today?
We're going to talk about something called Please Hear What I'm Not Saying.
So this title is actually taken from a poem by Charles Fenn. It was written in 1966. I love that title because there's so much that people aren't saying when we're communicating that we need to tune into. So I say the word tune because we're going to talk a lot today about attunement. There's that word picture of a tuning fork. I'm not a music person, but the way that it works is you hit it on something, and if you hold it up to your ear, it makes the perfect pitch and the perfect sound that tunes to one string on your guitar. So if you hit the tuning fork, put it up to your ear, and then hold up the guitar and hit that one string, that's how you tune that one string. And then once that is tuned, you can tune the rest of your guitar. And so in a really similar way, this is something that we need to do in our interactions with one another. There's what we're communicating and what we're saying on an informational level, but we also need to tune into the things that are not being said. So the emotions behind it, the nonverbals, the body language. And so that's what today is about. Attunement is the ability to be aware of what another person is experiencing on a deeper level. We hear that phrase about body language. So let's start there. How do we attune to people physically?
Yeah, there's like a lot of hand and head gestures, can mark enthusiasm, and consistent eye contact can convey confidence or comfort. What I've noticed, it can also convey disinterest. So I try to keep a heads up on that when I'm talking to people. I try to convey disinterest sometime with body language, and people don't ever seem to pick it up. I need to be like, I go for subtlety, and I really want people to get the hint so I don't have to like notch up to the next level. But oftentimes people just completely miss the body language that I'm just not interested in.
Just our stance, like our physical stance. If we're leaning toward the door, like open to somebody leaning forward, or more of a closed stance, like arms crossed, leaning back. It communicates something very different than leaning forward and leaning in and making eye contact. But yeah, there's so much that we can pick up on just with body language, like shoulders slumped, someone's feeling down, feeling discouraged. And when we're attuning, what we want to do is, in some ways, is mirror what's going on with them to show them that we're with them. So, if Jeff's sharing something really hard because he's such a bleeding heart,
Oh, yeah. All the time.
But if Jeff's sharing something hard and he's seated and just kind of talking through it, it would not be helpful for me to stand up, never get down, never get on the same eye level. Just getting in that same physical space is super helpful. I remember one time something really bad had happened and we had to go to a party with a bunch of people. But a pastor friend of mine was there and he tuned in right away that something was wrong with me. And I remember I was sitting in a chair and he asked a question and just he could hear what I wasn't saying.
Yeah.
And he immediately, because he was standing and I was sitting, he got down on one knee, he leaned forward, and he just started asking questions and totally attuning. And all these years later, it still stands out in my mind just because of him getting down on his knee and getting on this, like, attuning physically to the level that I was on.
Yeah. Sometimes we don't even know ourselves when something is off. And we just say words because they're the right words to say. We're fine, everything's great. But, taking that extra step to say it's not what I'm saying, or, what's really going on. We can even surprise ourselves when someone notices something that maybe we hadn't even planned to talk about. So if they're a safe person, that's awesome, because then it opens the door for us to start, to maybe start exploring some of that or sharing selectively. It can be kind of liberating.
Let's talk about emotional attunement. So the feelings that are behind what somebody is saying. How do we do that? How do we attune emotionally?
I don't have emotions really, so don't ask me.
We all have emotions. Some of us just aren't in touch with our
No, you
emotions.
humans have emotions.
I think I'm Mr. Rogers when it comes to attuning emotionally, and just the idea of name it to tame it. Sometimes just putting a name to an emotion can be so liberating in itself, to be able to say, it sounds like you're feeling this, or this is what I'm hearing. And we don't have to impose. It's enough to just ask, or to just reflect back what we're hearing to the other person. It can be really, really liberating.
Yeah, and we can pick up on the subtleties too. The quiver in somebody's voice, the tears maybe welling up in their eyes. Those kind of things are communicating things. And sometimes what people are saying is not matching up with the body language and with the emotion behind it. So for instance, sometimes somebody will be sharing something super hard, but they have a really big smile on their face. And it always makes me wonder, like, what, the smile kind of feels like something they're hiding behind because you're sharing something really hard. And so tuning into, like, I'm curious, like, how do you really feel? Because this is really hard what you're sharing, or the opposite. Sometimes people will be sharing some really great news, but it's like you're not hearing the excitement. You're not, there's just kind of a sadness or a sorrow that probably has nothing to do with what they're sharing because it doesn't match. But even asking questions there, like, hey, you don't seem very excited about this. And what's really going on? And a lot of times people will shift then and say, yeah, well, this is going on over here. And it's an opportunity to connect in that way.
Don't you think that can be a little bit intimidating for people, though? Because I think so many of us are just so much more comfortable living on the surface. And even if we notice something, it might be something that we reflect on to our spouse later on, but we may not want to bring it up. We may feel like, just depending on, what kind of attachment style we have, what kind of, family culture we come from, we may not feel like it's okay to ask people how they're doing, but often that's exactly what they need, right? And then you can kind of gauge, is this something that they're ready to unpack, or are you just signaling to them that you're safe to talk to when they are ready to talk about it? But I think that takes inner work in ourselves to go beyond that, kind of emotional avoidance, or feel like we don't want to ask because we don't want someone to get emotional or, not know how to respond. Not everybody's comfortable going there.
But I think timing is so important too. Sometimes people don't want to answer those questions in front of other people.
Yeah, that's true.
So taking time later to ask, just saying something to let them know that you're an open door to talk about it later is so important. And I love what you said earlier, putting words to it, to what you're hearing. I don't know that you said it like that, but so if you and I, we go to group together on Thursday night. We come here, how was your day? We start talking. If you start describing something that's going on in your family and then something that's going on in work, but just finding the emotion behind what you're hearing, because that's information. Yeah. But attuning to, this is really overwhelming, and putting that into words. Like, I'm just overwhelmed listening to you talk about it. Yeah. And usually if you hit the emotion that someone is feeling, they'll go, yes. And then they share more because they feel heard. They feel understood.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anything else to add over there about emotions?
Well, I mean,
Is it uncomfortable to talk about emotions?
No, it's just I prefer it. I'm just more cerebral by nature, and I think that there's something to be said for keeping emotions at bay too. I'm thinking about like a professional setting and in meetings and everything, and we all have meetings with with our teams, and things can get emotional because most of us take our profession personally to one degree or another. And I think there's just also something to be said about time and place, and being able to express something depending on time and place as objectively as possible, as cool and restrained as possible, because people oftentimes are much more receptive to what we're saying when we can kind of tone down the emotion and express the thought or express the feelings without necessarily the emotionally charged language. Emotionally charged language can lead to accusations and putting down other people's ideas and things like that. So And especially also responding to people in certain settings, when they get emotionally amped up and you need to turn down the temperature in the room a little bit. There's something to be said about that.
I think attunement, even in those moments, can be helpful too. Like, I can tell this is a hot topic for you, or, I can tell this is bringing up a lot of frustration for you. But even attunement in those moments helps communicate that they feel a little bit more understood.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's get back to, whatever it is the meeting is about. But I hear your frustration. Let's take some time later to share.
Sometimes, that's really all people need, is for someone to recognize that they're upset about this, that, or the other in a conversation, and set aside some time and space later on to talk about it.
I think what can happen sometimes is our emotions leak. Like, if they're not acknowledged, if we don't recognize them, if we aren't naming them to tame them, they'll leak out one way or the other. They'll either leak out because we suppress to the point of exploding or disengaging, so we go into fight or flight, or they'll leak out in terms of being passive aggressive, like making a snide comment to someone that maybe seems to come out of left field, but it's really because something went unacknowledged earlier, or people can get sarcastic. I think all of those are kind of bodyguards essentially to those deep emotions. So there's an importance to being self-regulated, which I think is what you're getting at, that we need to be self-regulated. But that in itself requires attunement to ourselves. That requires attunement to this has the potential to really rile me up. So I'm just going to be attuned to that in myself, so I can move forward without letting it surprise me, without letting that like anger monster or fear monster or sadness monster pop up. I'm going to be attuned to that. And the same thing with other people, right? Like being attuned to, okay, let me understand where this person's coming from, so I can bring down, it's like a release valve, right? So you can bring that temperature down for them. So I think they're complementary concepts. I don't think they're opposed.
Okay, let's talk about verbal attunement. So we've talked about physical, we've talked about emotional, and then this is picking up on verbal cues, because talking fast, talking loud, talking slow, not talking, those are all communicating things as well. So how do we attune verbally?
I think that's where mirroring is really helpful, like mirroring back to the person what they said, or even to some extent emotions, being able to let them know that they're being heard and acknowledge that, and really validate that you're hearing them the right way. I think those are ways that we can attune to people. And if they are kind of processing a lot or saying a lot that seems disconnected, I think it's helpful even to be able to say, it sounds like there's a lot going on, or it sounds like you're working through a lot of different things, or just kind of summarizing for the person. I think those are great ways to attune to them.
Yeah, talking a lot and really fast, that can be communicating anxiety.
Yes.
So we need to be attuned to that rather than just, oh my gosh, you never shut up. It's like, okay, there's a lot of anxiety here.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what do I do with that, or how do I help with that? Not saying much can be just a lack of interest in what people are talking about. You ever been in a group of people and one person's just not talking, and then all of a sudden you change topics and it's like they totally come alive and they're talking fast and they're animated, like, whoa, where have you been last
That's because
hour?
you were missing their body language. That they didn't care, and you just kept going. just wanted to reconnect to that.
Oh my goodness. But don't you think sometimes, though, people can process internally, and so it can seem like they're disengaged, but in reality they're reflecting and kind of mulling things over. And some people process things externally. They use a lot of words to process things, to the point that you're like, like that song, like shut up to shut up, right? Like it's super rude, and we would never say that to anybody. But sometimes you're just like, oh my goodness, that's just a lot. That's a lot for me to take in, right? Yeah. But it's because people process information differently. Along those lines, I'm reminded, of course, of Brene Brown talking about a vulnerability hangover, where we can sometimes we haven't had a chance to let that valve release pressure, and so when we do, it can be so overwhelming that later we're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I said all of that, and what words do I need to take back, and can't believe I overshared. But it's because we're we're in such need, right? We're in so much need. Like the proverb says, what a man desires is unfailing love, better to be poor than a liar. Like just, we need to admit that we want to be heard, we want to be understood. And that's a universal need.
Remember one time my dad and my sister came out. They're from Iowa, so they wanted to go swimming. I don't have a pool, so we went over to this guy's house to go swimming, and he is a talker. I mean, just talking. Like you can't get a word in. And if we go to like the physical attunement, just not tuning into disinterest or like, hey, like come up for air so that someone else can talk. And it was just kind of overwhelming. But he went to the diving board and he was talking all the way up to the diving board, dove into the pool. And as soon as he went under the water, my dad and my sister looked at me like, oh my gosh. It was like the 10 seconds they were going to have to say something to me. They're like, oh my gosh, does he ever stop? As soon as he came up out of the water, he started talking again. I mean, it was incredible, but it is that lack of attuning to other people. But looking back now is anxiety. I mean, just
Oh, yeah.
go. But it was kind of humorous at the time. But, you know, he was communicating other things than what he was saying by his amount of talking.
Yeah. So I'm the person in this roundtable discussion that wants everybody to say it and then stop talking. It was on a Zoom Saturday morning, and you know I just had a certain role, and in part of that role was taking some notes, but I also had to extend my role into keeping people on track. And this one lady, I mean, we had like 20 minutes and she spoke for like the first 15 minutes, like nonstop.
Oh, my
and she was missing all of my cues. And I had to interrupt her at one point. She'd be like, I need you to distill that into one or two sentences for the sake of our notes. I didn't say it like that. I said it more professionally. But it's just the whole time, like I'm sending her body language cues and she's completely missing it because just like your talkers, they're so focused on what they're saying, it's like they just can't see what the rest of us, like the Jeffs of the world, when we're sending you a message, like you made your point 7 minutes ago, 7 minutes and 27 seconds, I've been timing it, and you're still going, stop.
Attunement, like not attuning physically to the room and the space and the people.
So it's just like for everybody out there who likes just clear and concise communication like me, you're not alone. You know, and in a lot of group conversations, you know, I'm often, because there's a population of us out there that, you know, when we're quiet, it's not always a lack of interest. It's because we are actually listening very carefully to what everybody else is saying, and we're reading the room. And when we speak, we're going to keep it short, sweet, and to the point, because we're also processing about how to distill everything that we're thinking into a few sentences. And honestly, like sometimes it is kind of a smug way to show everybody else, you can say this in 20 seconds and then stop talking.
Do you think though that there's an opportunity there to lean into what the person's saying to accelerate the process? Like as uncomfortable as it is, right?
Yeah.
Is there a place for leaning into attunement to try to shorten what they're saying? Although conversely, of course, there's the risk that they feel heard, so they feel like it's an open door to say more. Yeah. But
one thing I think that is helpful is if someone's going on, and it's hard when there's not like space, like there's no period, you know, it really is hard. But what's helpful, I think, is say, I'm going to interrupt here for just a second. What I hear you saying is, and try to summarize what they've said and say, is that what you're trying to say? You know, not give a question, not like, tell me more, but just, is this what you're trying to say? So that they do feel heard, but you've summarized it. So that can be helpful, but it's just getting the courage sometimes to interject. It can be difficult for some people. So let's talk about relational attunement. Just the word relational has the word relate in it. So relationships really are formed from how we relate to one another. That communicates something. What are examples of this?
I think a lot of our communication can be indirect. And the closer we are to someone, sometimes the more we expect them to just read our minds, right? And so we can tend towards that indirect communication with them. Or we can forget that we need to articulate how we're feeling and what we need. We act it out. We act out our feelings. And so being attuned to, first of all, the impact that we're having on our partner and the way that we're acting, I think is really important. Like, how is my behavior or how are my words being received? And is that really what I want? Is that really leading to the flourishing of my relationship? But also, if someone is acting a little out of character, leaning into it, not running away from it, or saying, like, I think it's very typical to just say, like, oh, she's moody, he's moody, I'm just gonna leave and hang out, or even excuses like, I've got a church activity or something, where we can get into relational avoidance because we don't want to be attuned to where the person is. It's scary to lean into that relationally, but that's where the beauty is in relationships, right? Is if we're able to move past that and really be attuned with each other, really be in sync.
I think it's always helpful to ask yourself the question, is the relationship reciprocal? If you do an inventory and you realize, I'm always the one reaching out, I'm always the one planning get-togethers, I'm always the one inviting. If we're tuning in, like, they're not maybe as invested as we are. So just looking at the relationship in those ways helps us understand what's going on. Is there distance between the two of us? Is it one-sided? Do we share deep things? Is it just kind of surface level? Those things are all communicating things.
Yeah, I think there's something we said there too for attachment styles, that if you're just different attachment styles and you're the I'm not okay, you're okay type, and you're in a relationship with the I'm okay, you're not okay type, and so you're always the one initiating, but the other person is just wired differently and just has a completely different attachment style. I think there are things to consider there as well.
I think it communicates something even more if your relationship was different in the past and then you're looking at it now. This is different. But if it's always been that way, I suppose it's communicating the same thing. It always has been.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So here's the last one, behaviorally. We look at behavioral patterns. Yeah. How do people's actions or inactions communicate things?
I think what I'm about to say started with child psychology, but it's so relevant for grown-ups as well, that behavior is communication. The way people act is communicating things. Realizing that is so helpful for attunement, and it's helpful for us to not take some things personally. Like, okay, what is this person's behavior telling me? Especially when their behavior is displeasing to us in some way.
Yeah.
And even the behaviors of showing up and being there. Maybe the behaviors communicating, like kind of checking out, or I'm going to be less involved, and that's fine. But sometimes we can look past the simplest things. Like that's communicating something.
That's, I think, is a prime place, though, where we make assumptions about other people's motives if they act a certain way. Because it's more comfortable to just make an assumption or to superimpose what we would be thinking, we might be thinking if we acted the same way, rather than asking them, rather than just acknowledging, hey, that was a little weird, or hey, I noticed this. I think this is another Brene Brown expression, right? But like, the story I'm telling myself is fill in the blank. And often the story we're telling ourselves is so far off from what's actually happening that we need to be attuned to ourselves too in that moment, in addition to trying to tune into what's going on with the other person.
Well, I like that, tuning into ourselves, because it seems very natural for a lot of people to make an assumption about another person's motive. And I've been thinking about that a lot the last few years and working that out of myself, to make no assumptions about people's motives. I'm not a mind reader. That can also be a boundary issue. At least it feels like it with me when people assume my motive for something. For me, that is crossing a boundary. Like, I feel like a boundary has been violated with that. Like anybody else, I don't like it when a boundary gets violated. It doesn't feel good.
So really what we're talking about in a lot of ways, it's about being a good listener. Because if we're attuning to all the things that we've been saying, we're listening to what people aren't saying, we're listening to what they're saying. And why is that topic so important, especially as believers?
Christians should be the best listeners in the world. And unfortunately, we're becoming known for, some negative things, and what we ought to work on becoming known for is being safe people you can talk about anything to, and who are going to attune and invest that emotional and relational energy into understanding where you're coming from and what it's like to be in your shoes.
There's a term that I love, which is normalizing. The whole idea is to liberate someone who's going through something by helping them to know that is totally normal. Like what you're going through is normal. You're not the first person in the world to go through this.
Right.
And that's where I think that we have such a richness in scriptures with so many different people in the Bible that went through so many different things. Like, we, above more than anybody, have such a wealth to draw from in terms of saying, hey, you are not the first person in the world to struggle with that, or you're not the first person in the world to try this and it doesn't work out. And to bring that empathy to people and to normalize what they're going through so they don't feel isolated or weird or like there's something wrong with them for just going through the normal human experience. I think that there is such a hunger for attunement. There is such a hunger to feel like you're understood and your experience is validated, that if you don't find a healthy place for that, you become a prey for people that want to manipulate your emotions. There's people that that are con artists, or people that are predators, or people that are abusive, have a knack for tuning into people's vulnerabilities and exploiting them. So just knowing that we're predisposed towards that makes it all the more necessary for us to look for healthy community where we have safe spaces where people want our flourishing, not to manipulate our emotions or make us feel heard while taking us to a dark place rather than taking us to a place of light and joy and freedom.
I had a lady today that I was in here working by myself, so I had the door locked because I was going in and out from the back, and she rang the doorbell. So I answered, and she just said, hey, I just got a job in the area, and I've been in this lot a lot, and I see your window marketing. And so she said, can you tell me a little bit about Reset? So I started sharing, and I noticed just while I was sharing, tears were welling up in her eyes a little bit. And she started sharing about herself and her background. And basically what she was asking was, would you accept me if I came here? Like, she didn't say it in those words, but that was what she was communicating. Given what I just told you, would this be a place for me? So we talked a little bit, and then I just said, can I pray for you? And we prayed together, and she was just crying. Now, if in that little interaction, I mean, that's just like the very, very tip of the iceberg of whatever all she's going through. But how do we get underneath the surface and get into the nitty gritty? Because she was saying, this is the kind of place that exactly what I need. Well, what if we're not safe?
Oh, wow.
What if she feels judged? What if she doesn't feel accepted? What if we don't listen? It's a highlight to me of why this topic is so important, because this place, any Christian place, should be the safest place to talk through those things. I love this saying by David Augsburger. He says, being heard is so close to being loved that for the average person, they are almost indistinguishable. That's why this topic is so important. So how do we become better attuners?
Part of it is setting yourself aside, working on these things to reach the point where you can set yourself aside, which is harder and harder and harder in our culture, because our culture tells us to make ourselves heard and amplify our voices through this or that platform. But attunement requires us to become smaller and become less, so that another person can feel safe enough to share more of themselves.
Jesus left his world, he left heaven and came to earth. That's a good picture of what listening is like. I leave my world and I enter into yours by attuning to what you're saying, to what you're not saying. My world is just set it over here for now, because right now it's about you. But if we stay in that space of listening to just the words and just the information, trying to formulate a response, particularly if someone's talking about something hard, we're just going to be thinking of advice.
Oh, yeah,
Which
absolutely.
is not helpful when we're processing something hard. But if I can set my world aside and allow myself to begin feeling a little bit of what you're feeling and giving you a safe space to talk.
Yeah, well, and I think we're also more likely to change if we feel understood and liberated. We feel like our story is understood, because that can give us the freedom to explore other options without being stuck in our own story. But I think it comes back to our heart for other people and asking God to give us his heart for people and understanding their stories and valuing their stories, valuing their experiences, and exercising that muscle of leaning into people's stories rather than judging, rather than fixing, rather than solving, but just exploring where they are. There's even evidence that that's how people get out of cults. They're more likely to be liberated through relationships than through fancy arguments. It's a ministry. Being attuned to people is a ministry.
It is. And so many of people's problems, they're so much more likely to get healed and grow and solve problems when they discover it themselves, when they have self-revelation or Holy Spirit revelation, rather than us just, boom, here's what you need to do. Here's the advice. Here's my perspective. Because we come at people with truth right away and they're just not open to it.
No. Thinking about the verse where Jesus talks about taking the log out of your own eye so that you can see to take the branch out of your brother's eye. And we instinctively think of that as, sin, like we should stop sinning before we talk to someone else about their sin. But I think there's more to it. I think it's more like understanding the noise that's going on in ourselves that makes it difficult to hear someone else, our own anger, our own unforgiveness, our own, judging, our own idols, the things that are sacred to us that, maybe we feel like someone has violated, our values that we feel like someone doesn't appreciate. All of those create this mental noise that make it really difficult to tune into other people. I think that's what's going on so much in the current environment. There's a lot of talk about how we are all in echo chambers. We're all in media silos where algorithms are able to micro-target people according to their interests. And so people actually today have different versions of reality, completely different versions of the reality, because the algorithms have micro-targeted them and fed them a certain set of information. And the only way out of that is to recognize, what is it that's coming in? What's coming into my soul? What does that say about me? What's the tuning fork of the content I'm listening to? What is that tuning into in my heart? And do I really want that there? Do I want those emotions being activated in me? Is that the log that I need to take out of my eye? Because without that, we're not going to be able to build bridges to other people. We're not going to be able to empathize with their fears and their concerns. And that's where Christians have the opportunity to lead forward, to, just taking this beyond a micro level. Like that's true in, I think, challenging personal relationships where we have differences of opinion with people, or where someone is, maybe distant from us that we want to connect to. But even on a macro level, where we need to be the bridge builders, and we, more than anybody, should have the ability to discern what's going on in our hearts and to start to see clearly so that we can attune to what other people are saying, even if it's different than what we think.
You do have an opportunity to speak the truth in love if you're willing to invest the time through listening.
Earn that right.
Yeah.
I don't want anybody coming near my eyes, especially if they can't see clearly. But if they can see clearly, then it's a benefit. Then I can relax. I can trust them. I can open my eyes. It's a lot of work, but I think it's what we're called to. I think that's part of the Christ-likeness that we're called to.
Thank you for listening. We hope this message encouraged you. For additional resources or information on our upcoming events, head to resetministries.us. That's resetministries.us.